the goal of this manual, the goals we have for our projects are generally to improve human safety by not hitting large animals on the road and keeping them off the road. We also want to improve or maintain habitat connectivity for both terrestrial species, regardless of their size, and potentially for select feral species and free-ranging livestock. And the literature review has considerations about connectivity for free-ranging livestock as well as feral species, because it's partially value-based. Do you regard them as feral species, these burros and horses, or do you want them to have a place in the ecosystem regardless of their historic background? Similar to the literature review, the manual has 3 different sections. One focused on large wild mammal species, the second one dealing with the free-ranging livestock, which is by definition owned, and feral species that are not owned, but they are domestic, meaning horses and cattle. Finally, the third species group is the smaller species, and we heard about those species specifically from Cheryl in her presentations. Now, the measures that are discussed in the manual are not the same measures, or have very limited overlap with the measures that are in the literature review. The literature review is extensive. Anything was investigated, tried, we listed there, right? But the manual, it's really focused on practical applicability, providing you with guidelines. If you have this problem, then do this in that way. So the way we selected measures is that, well, we are assuming that a road and the traffic that uses the road remain. There may be situations in a protected area where you are able to remove a road or close it seasonally. But for the purpose of this manual, we're basically assuming it's a public road and the main purpose is safe and efficient transportation, and we can't do away with the road. So it's one assumption, and it means that certain mitigation measures, including road removal and closure, are not included in the manual. We also consider, for example, culling, not a good measure for free-ranging livestock, which is owned. The rancher would have a problem with that. It's just all logical, right? About what we include and exclude. And for large wild mammal species and small terrestrial species, we want to have effective mitigation measures when it comes to collision reduction, but we do not want to have measures that do not address the barrier effect of roads and traffic, or worse, increase the barrier effect of roads and traffic. And that means that for these species, we are left with just barriers, fences in combination with wildlife crossing structures. For free-ranging livestock, it all depends on your value. Of course, we want to reduce collisions, especially for our own sake. And when it comes to large feral species and even livestock, also for the animal's sake. But again, depending on the values that you have, you may or may not want to provide for connectivity, either assisted connectivity, where you're actively moving animals, and it's in context of livestock is quite defensible and common practice, but maybe not so much when you're dealing with feral species. And if you want to manage them similar to wild species. Again, this is hugely debatable, and our society hasn't seen the end of this debate. It's very contentious. So that means that we end up with a different list of potential mitigation measures for free-ranging livestock, because assisted mitigation is an option. You can get away with measures that only address the collision issue, for example, animal detection systems. But you may also implement barriers, either as standalone or in combination with crossing structures. For the horses and burros that roam free and considered feral, no owner, because they're non-native, depending on your values and depending on your perspective of their place in the landscape, you might consider culling or relocation or anti-fertility treatment, where you basically limit the size of the population. Roadside animal detection systems are an option, as well as fences in combination with crossing structures. So these are the measures that are included in the manual. Other measures are not included because they don't really address the issues at hand, and there's little use in providing practical suggestions for the planning and design, implementation, operation. We just focus on the measures that are likely to help us reach our objectives. So this manual is heavily illustrated with photographs, also practical tables, I believe. Rather than going through it in a very long session, which we don't have time for anyway, I'll just point out a few of the main things. So we hinted at this earlier today, but it is very important when we have a project that we are extremely specific about goals. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And that can be quite general, our goals. But when it comes to our objectives, maybe we should get down to the species level. And is it only about collision reduction, also about the barrier effect? Are other factors at play, other types of effects of roads and traffic on wildlife as well? We just have to be very specific, because we're not specific, we can't possibly design a package of mitigation measures that we believe is helping you to achieve those objectives. We have to be very clear about what it is that we want. So consistency between the goals, the objectives, and the planning and design process. If you don't have your planning and design consistent with your objectives, you can't possibly be successful. Now, in that context, I think it's also important in the transportation world to realize that we do not have to restrict ourselves to engineering specifications for the mitigation measures. In fact, it should probably be a combination of both engineering specifications and ecological specifications, because ultimately the animals and how they use and interact, the infrastructure that we provide for them is important. So, for example, if we build an overpass, it's not just about how much load and how high should it be so that traffic can pass underneath with large heavy loads on semi trucks, but it's also about, well, what is important to the animals? It's not just the width, it's also the approach slopes, and how far out in the surrounding landscape do we build these approach slopes so that they can gradually approach the structure and can kind of see to the other side. So these are just examples of this ecological design specifications that I think we can and perhaps should be incorporating into the specifications when we set the sideboards for our design process. Then when it comes to construction, implementation, I often hear it's not rocket science. It's true, it's not rocket science, but it doesn't mean that it is impossible to make mistakes. In fact, when we look at what we build, and I know I look at a lot of locations, but there's so much that seems preventable, where either it's a design issue or it's an installation construction issue, that if only we would have had an ecologist on site to oversee the entire process, particularly in the field. Even if the design plans look good, when you are in the field and actually building these fences and underpasses, overpasses, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And we know, based on how we organize our work within transportation departments, it's extremely difficult to come back at a later time and correct these issues. So the more upfront work we can do with careful formulations of goals, objectives, a consistent planning and design process, but don't check out, make sure that ecologists are present throughout the entirety of the project. Just as a short anecdote, an extreme example from Brazil, where large overpasses were built for arboreal animals, basically metal structures above the road connecting the canopy, and the design plans were great, and vehicles can drive underneath, right? You come in the field and there's a couple of ones, this is good, connect canopy to canopy. And then most of the locations were actually on a slope. On one side, the upslope, they are on the ground level because they had to cut the slope, and the other side they connect to the canopy. So we're providing connectivity from the ground to the canopy. It's not a canopy crossing. And you think, how can that be, right? Because there's no oversight during the entire process. Nobody actually bothers to go into the field and realize it's not a flat area, it is a slope, right? Anyway, we are not immune to this either in North America. Monitoring. We touched upon this afternoon and morning. If we don't measure what goes on, we don't know if we reach our objectives or if there is a problem. And then if there's a problem, do have structures in place to do adaptive management. So that is something we should think about. I shared my ideas about outsourcing some of that stuff to recognize that maybe, currently our structure in the organization and associated finances do not allow us to be very responsive. And last consideration, talked about the goals, objectives, what is it that we want to achieve, and then we go in planning and design. It is very easy to lose track of effectiveness because we have desires. We want something, and this is true in society in general, that is simple, low cost, easily implemented tomorrow over long distances, right? And the political pressure, sometimes fed by the public, is such that we have to address these desires. But as professionals, we have to make sure that whatever comes out of that process is still likely addressing the problems at hand. If it is not addressing the problems at hand, this is just throwing away money. And even though it seems so simple, I see a lot of examples where during the process, we lose track of what our goals and objectives were, and we do not put in place the measures that are most likely to help us reach those objectives.